I am delighted to be here. This book was inspired by my work here at Malaprops, my work in publishing, but mostly by the relationships that I built with people who work in bookstores and the people who keep indie bookstores thriving by patronizing them and making sure that these places continue to be, hubs of local culture and places that are inclusive, wonderful third spaces for everybody. That is the joy and the best part of working and participating in the life of an independent bookstore. So this book was very much a love letter in that way, and a way for me to sort of process a lot of big feelings that I have about independent bookstores. Stephanie, am I okay to start? Okay. So the first time that I ever knew that I should work at an independent bookstore, I was living in Boston. I was in graduate school getting a master's degree in children's literature at Simmons University. And one of my professors there, this woman, Anita Sylvie, she's a celebrated children's book author. She was a former publisher at Houghton Mifflin Books for Young Readers, and a celebrated children's literature critic who's written many great books on the subject of children's books. And I was going through a hard time when I first moved to Boston, and I needed another job. I'd been working at the Apple Store, and it was just not for me anymore. I wanted another job, and I went to Anita because I knew she had a lot of contacts, and she was also just very wise. I thought she could give me some good advice. So she gave me this piece of advice, which is that the best way to learn about publishing is to work for a fine independent bookstore. And so it just so happened that there was an opening at a bookstore in Cambridge, Porter Square Books, and Anita made a phone call and recommended me for that job. And even though Malaprops is my bookstore home, I grew up in Asheville. I've been coming to this bookstore for as long as I can remember. It never occurred to me to work here. I don't know why in high school I was too busy, being a lifeguard in the summer or working at the mall. And so I really hate when I look back and realize what I missed, how much far ahead I might be in my life if I actually been able to work at Malaprops when I was younger. But all that to say, my bookstore work began at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, and I am forever indebted to them for hiring me, because I learned a lot about book selling and publishing. And during this time in my life, I was starting to think about writing books of my own, but I wasn't quite there yet. Then things changed in Boston. I couldn't afford to live there anymore. It's a really expensive town. And I was working at a publishing house, a job that I loved, editing children's books, but it just wasn't feasible to stay there anymore. And I made the heartbreaking decision of leaving and coming back home. And I read this quote not long after I got back, this quotation from Carl Sandburg. Strange things blow in through my window on the wings of the night wind, and I don't worry about my destiny. And I thought, this is the place that we should all inhabit in our lives, right? We were going through changes and things aren't working out the way we wanted them to. So I just leaned in and I applied for a job here at Malaprops. They were miraculously hiring. And I applied for the job as a bookseller. I got hired. And then shortly thereafter, they needed a children's book buyer. And so I grew into that role, and it is hands down the best job I've ever had. I left Malaprops about a year ago, and I left the job in the very capable hands of a wonderful bookseller named Nate Tadlock, but I have missed this job every single day since I left. So I grew up coming to Malaprops, and this kid would come to Malaprops on Saturdays, and she liked books, she liked to read, she liked to bicycle and roller skate, although not at the same time, although this photo suggests that. But this kid didn't know where her life was going. And she didn't know that she was going to be somebody who could write books. And I look at this picture and I just think what I wouldn't give to be able to whisper in her ear and tell her that she was going to be able to have this incredible experience and the privilege of being a published author, and to be able to build on that experience by working in independent bookstores. I met this dog while I was working at Malaprops. I say this because there is a spread in the book that includes some dogs. And I think that it's really lovely how the illustrator, we talked a lot about, E.B. Goodell, the incredible illustrator of the book, she also worked at an independent bookstore in Harvard Square before, in a different store years before I did, called Curious George. It is no longer. We're going to talk a little bit about some of her references to bookstores from real life in a minute, but this is just one of the experiences I had every day working in an independent bookstore, meeting these, great dogs. Everybody's welcome at an independent bookstore, especially your canine companions. These are my companions at Malaprop, some of them. And one of the great joys of working here was I got to help with some event programming, and I would say things like, hey, could we have a Stranger Things trivia night? And everyone would say yes. And then I would say, well, can we come in costume? And everyone would say yes. And then I said, can Patricia and I wear our roller skates? And they said, sure. And so you can't see Patricia's roller skates, but she's there and she's wearing them right next to me, blowing the giant obnoxious bubble. But it was supposed to be the 80s. So, I think that photo's pretty authentic. But this photo just encapsulates the joy that I felt every day getting to come to work here. I couldn't believe they paid me to do these events. Like, I still can't. It was just a way for me to nerd out with my favorite things. We did Hamilton events, Hamilton trivia nights. I don't think we ever made any money selling books at these events, but they were packed. And there would be children in here that would come to participate in Hamilton lip syncs that we would do, talent contests. They would come for the trivia night when we were celebrating the Stranger Things television show. And what was so amazing about those events was not that we sold a bunch of books and made a lot of money. That really wasn't even the point with those, thankfully, because they let me keep doing it. But it was showing young readers that independent bookstores are places where you celebrate the things that you love. And it doesn't matter if what you love is different or weird, or if you're into Broadway musicals and everyone else, isn't. There's a place here for you. And that was a big part of those events when I was here, is being able to connect with young readers and let them know all of the things that were available for them at a bookstore. So all of these things influenced me writing Goodnight Little Bookstore. And what actually precipitated me starting to write it, we had closed Malaprops one night, and the store looks really beautiful after you lock the door and you step back, especially if you cross the street. It's just, some of the lights are still on inside, and it just looks magical. It's just this perfect, mental photo that I have. And we were leaving one night, and good night, I kind of waved to the store and said good night, and then was walking to my car, and I thought, good night, little bookstore. And then by the time I got to my car, I was like, good night, little bookstore. Hold on. So I raced home and I started writing. I'll share some of that in a minute, but I want to share the book with you. So I thought I would talk a little bit about, just for a few minutes, about my process in writing this book, because everybody always seems interested in, like, what's your process? How did you do this? And it's such an awkward question, because I don't know many authors that have a very organized process, and mine is completely chaotic. I open multiple documents. I start on one, and then I'll close that, and I'll open another one, and I'll take a completely different approach in another document, and then I lose documents, and then I have to go back and find them. But what happens is, I'm really good at naming documents, so I never lose anything. They just get hidden on my computer. But what happens magically with that is, when I rediscover old drafts, I find things that I'd forgotten that didn't work in the first draft, but might work in the 5th, 6th, or 10th draft. So in this first one here in gray on the left, this is a screenshot of the Notes app on my phone, where I do a lot of idea brainstorming. If I'm somewhere and can't get to a piece of paper, I'll just whip my phone out and start pecking it in my notes. And so this is dated September 18th, 2018 at 5:37 p.m. And this must be after that sort of initial brainstorm that I had when I left the store that night, because this was obviously, it was dark when we left, and this was at 5:30 in the afternoon. So that tells me there's a draft somewhere missing that I haven't found. But I was playing around with what are some things in the bookstore that we could say goodnight to, and a little bit with the rhyme. So this is very rough. And obviously I have abbreviated things: good night, little bookstore, time to close; good night, books in neat little rows; good night, cafe tables stacked with a chair; good night, cat asleep on the stairs. It's much better now than it was then. Good night, stockrooms, empty carts; good night, vacuum that never starts. Anyone who has ever worked in an independent bookstore has known the exquisite pain of having to vacuum the store and the vacuum won't work. And there's always 3 people in the store that the vacuum won't work for, no matter what they do. It'll work for everybody else. And then there's those 3 people, and you always think they're just trying to get out of vacuuming, but they're not. It's because the vacuums are possessed. I've worked at 2 independent bookstores, and this problem happened in both of them. So I'm convinced that there's some sort of weird magic happening there. And it looks like I wanted to talk about cheerful clutter. I don't know, goodnight families tucked into bed, goodnight stories about to be read. I mean, that's not bad, but it's not great. Goodnight windows, cheery and bright, goodnight doors locked up tight. That's okay, but then it also sounds like you're locking it up so tight you're afraid that somebody's going to break in. So I knew that was hitting a little too hard. Come back tomorrow. Apparently I was going to say goodnight to a rocking chair at one point. And then at the very bottom, this is my favorite and this is the truest sort of representation of my creative process. Then I decided that the book would be completely different, apparently down here at the bottom, and the book would be the protagonist, and the book is bored and can turn a page and be something new. I can keep you on the edge of your seat. Undoubtedly, that was supposed to be seat. But wherever I was typing and not paying attention. So I think the version that I have on the right is the early one that I sent to my agent. And this, or an approximate one like this, was the one that actually got submitted to the editor. So I wanted to share this with you since we've read the first one. This one's a little different. Good night, little bookstore. Time to close. Good night, bestsellers stacked in rows. Good night, doorbell. Ding, ding, ding. Good night, cash wrap. Ring, ring, cha-ching. Good night, new friends from far off places. Good night, familiar hometown faces. So some of the stuff is the same. Good night stories tucked between covers. Good night, cafe and coffee lovers. Good night, forgotten gloves and hat. Good night, bossy bookstore cat. Good night, stockroom's cozy clutter. Good night, pens and paper cutter. And I remember my editor suggested that we take that line out because this is a book for children and we don't want to seem like it's okay to play with paper cutters or scissors. And I thought, of course not. But I was writing this book from the perspective of a bookseller closing the store at night, and I was making lists of all the things that are in the store. So it was very factual to me. That was the nonfiction writer in me trying to get it right, but it wasn't child-centered enough. And my editor at Candlewick, Mary Lee Donovan, is a brilliant children's book editor, and she made lots of little tiny suggestions that just polished the book and made it so much better than I could have ever made it by myself. Let's see, a couple more lines here. Good night, recycle. Let's see. Good night, shelves and teetering stacks. Good night, recycling sorted in sacks. That one made it. Good night, minutes that tick in the clock. Good night, key that fits in the lock. And I remember playing with this line because I wanted to give a sense of time. And I think sometimes when you listen to syllables, this is how it makes sense to me. This may make absolutely no sense to anybody else. But when I hear word sounds, they have a speed to me. I hear like a speed in syllables. So the K sound, click, clock, tick, tock, when you put those sounds close together, that feels like momentum building. And so I changed it from good night minutes that tick in the clock to good night store clock, tick, tick, tock, good night key that clicks in the lock, because it felt faster somehow. There was something about the quality of those sounds that that quickened the pace for me. So I was finessed that a little bit, I remember. Good night, booksellers, turn off the light. Good night, stars that wink in the night. You know, that's kind of schmaltzy. It didn't make it. We changed that, thankfully. Good night, little bookstores near and far. Good night, good readers, wherever you are. And so we played with the text, you know, and made sure that it was always very child-centered. And Mary Lee also encouraged this idea that we needed to point out more of the books that were in the bookstore. And she was very helpful with suggesting, you know, ways that I could do that, and lines that would be more sort of illustrative of the kinds of books that are in the store, and really putting that up front. Because again, I was thinking about this, like, what do we do to close the bookstore every night? I wasn't thinking about it from the beginning like a children's book author per se. And I had to sort of shift that mindset, and Mary Lee was really helpful with that. Great editors are, they make all the difference. Yeah, so, yeah, sorry, that's my That's my sweet dog. So yeah, that's how and why I wrote Goodnight Little Bookstore. That's where my inspiration came from. And I really hope that this book speaks to young readers who, you know, if they don't have a bookstore of their own, not everyone is lucky. I mean, in Asheville, we have multiple independent bookstores. Not everybody's fortunate enough to have an independent bookstore in their neighborhood. And so I really hoped that this book could, you know, show young readers that these are spaces for them and that there is wonder and joy to be found, and there's community here too. And so that's the thing that I'm most proud of this book is that I think it does that beautifully, and it does it in a way that I never could have imagined because the illustrator brought so much heart and atmosphere to the words that I put on a page. I mean, I just wrote a text. She is the one who created a vision for this world and made this beautiful little bookstore. I should say too quickly that there were a couple of more references. If you have ever been to Malaprops, there is a big paper mache tree over by the cash wrap. And when I sent Evie the illustration, or Evie the photo of the tree, she said, oh my gosh, we had one at Curious George too. And I knew that, I'd just forgotten, I'd been in Curious George, but I'd forgotten that they had a tree too. And so, you know, she just pulled some of these little touches of the bookstore that she knew and the bookstore that I knew. And then she brought all of this inclusivity and diversity to the story, which just takes the entire project to another level and makes it so much more appealing to all kinds of people and kids that deserve to see people that look like them in books. And I am forever indebted to her for that. I think that is such a crucial part of this book's journey. And I hope that it continues to be and people continue to discover it and that they love it too. And I hope you love it. And I thank you all for coming and tuning in at home. I'm happy to take some questions. If anyone has got questions, I will happily answer either, I guess, online or any of my esteemed audience members. Yes, Constance.
You did such a beautiful job with your rhyming scheme, and I know how hard that is. You know, I've worked on that myself with no luck. But did you get any pushback, or did you submit it to the first editor you submitted to wanted it, or did you hear from anyone? Oh, I don't know about rhyming bookstores, rhyming book, children's books, or
So I'll just repeat the question just in case. Constance wants to know if I got any pushback. I think because the text is a rhyming text.
Yeah.
And if you aren't familiar with children's publishing, writing a rhyming picture book is maddening for a few reasons, but one is that it's very hard to sell one. And I remember when I wrote this book, I thought, great, I've written this book of my heart. I have poured my guts out onto the page, my love for independent bookstores, and I so want this to connect with people who feel about these places the same way as I do. But the only way it came to me is a rhyming text. And so when I wrote the text and I was going to send it to my agent, I included this, you know, apology that it was a rhyming book, because I thought she's just gonna, you know, she's just gonna hate it that it's a rhyming book. But I wasn't giving her nearly enough credit. My agent is wonderful, and she emailed me back immediately and said that she loved it and that she was excited to submit it. And a couple of months after that, I think it's when we actually sold it to Mary Lee Donovan at Candlewick. So I had those feelings of serious trepidation about the rhyming text, but fortunately got away with it. But I think it can be really hard to do. I feel really fortunate that I was able to squeak this one in. I was glad. Anybody else have questions?
go ahead. We're going to find other questions for you.
Katie Brown?
So, traditionally, the books that I've seen write have been for middle grade to intermediate level and very scientifically and factually based. And I was curious when you mentioned that your editor said that you do more child focused. How did you, when you first approached writing this book, why did you decide to go so young? Why was that the moment that you said, I want to write a picture book for children?
You know, thankfully, I didn't I didn't decide at a certain moment that I was going to write this for a particular age group. The book just sort of arrived as a picture book. Some of my other books are longer form narrative nonfiction, which are, it's a very different process, tons of research and fact checking and round and round. And it's an incredibly absorbing process. Writing this book was like eating a cupcake. I mean, it was just, it was fun. You know, this is why people say, write what you know. And there's nothing I know more than how I feel and what it was like to work in an independent bookstore. And so I was very much able to just draw on that experience and write. And it just showed up as a rhyming picture book in my head. I heard, good night, little bookstore, time to close, good night, picture books. Actually, originally it was good night, bestsellers, face out in rows, because we have our bestsellers window right in the front of the store at Malaprops. And that's what I was thinking about when I wrote it. But Mary Lee changed the line, or suggested the change, very Socratic editor, to good night, little bookstore, time to close, good night, picture books, face out in rows, which of course is more child-centered. So she was able to just polish it in a way that made it more naturally child-centered. And I was really grateful for that. I think the book was always for children, but she just had a really solid vision in a way that I didn't have yet. I was really grateful to her for that. Stephanie?
We have a question from the at-home
great.
audience, and it's from Samuel, who's joining us from Nigeria.
Fantastic. Hi, Samuel.
And Samuel's asking, how did you have any writer's block when you were writing, and how did you overcome it if you did?
I have had writer's block many times. I had no writer's block at any point while writing this book, and that was the unbridled joy of writing this book. It's the easiest book that I've ever written. It just sort of came to me in, about 3 drafts. I think I was ready to share it with my agent. So it is the book that I look to because it reminds me when I'm working on a longer form narrative nonfiction project that are so time consuming and arduous, it takes so much study and research that my process doesn't always look like that. There's going to be moments. Hopefully there's another book in my brain somewhere that's going to come out like this one and feel as natural as this one did. But for this book, absolutely no writer's block whatsoever. It was just pure fun from the get-go. Anybody else have questions?
I love the illustrations so much, and I love is it a coincidence that she worked at a bookstore? Did someone try to find someone who had that experience, or just was the luck of the draw?
The fact that the illustrator and I both worked in independent bookstores was a complete accident.
Wow.
And we really, bonded over that because there's this feeling that you have when you work at an independent bookstore that is imparted to you in a very organic way, so completely that you don't even realize it's happened. You become this champion against the big guy. You're the little bookstore that could, and it is this kinship you have with people who've worked at independent bookstores. And the minute you meet a bookseller, I was in Germany researching one of my other books, In the Shadow of the Moon, and I walked into a bookstore and walked up to a bookseller and said hello. I spoke no German. She of course spoke perfect English, and I told her that I wrote children's books, and she walked me around the store, asked me about the bookstore where I worked. I told her about Malaprops. She told me about her store. She showed me her staff pics. She asked about my writing. She asked about my process. And it's like, I had known this woman for years, and we spent maybe half an hour together in a country that I'd never set foot in before. Wow. And that kind of connection that you have with people who've had this experience is really powerful. And so when it was revealed to me that, first of all, when I heard that Evie Goodale was going to be illustrating this book, I fell off of my chair because I love her work, and she is incredibly talented. All of her books are amazing. And I couldn't believe that she'd also worked in an independent bookstore. So it was this, just chance, just pure chance.
Perfect.
And it really ended up being great.
I mean, the love from the writing and the artwork just is so clearly inhabiting this book.
Thank you.
And I know it sounds like you really you sent her some photos and you left her to her own devices. I was just wondering if there was anything you said to her, like, could you please make sure to include a book cover of, like, was there any suggestions that specifically wanted?
No, and we talked about, it was more thinking about references to the stores, because she didn't seem to, I knew she wasn't going to do a cookie cutter version of either store. She was going to imagine her own. She was going to build our bookstore.
Right.
And so, I sent her references, subtle references to things. I mean, if you live in Asheville and this book, if you come to Malaprops to buy the book and someone says, hey, this book is, the girl who wrote this book used to work here, and you spot that gnome, you're going to know. The gnome knows. You're going to know. And so it was little things like that that are really inside jokes between, me and my peers here at the bookstore. I knew they would get it. I knew they would recognize the birdhouse, hanging in our little tree, but I didn't ask Emily to include the birdhouse. She just did. So it was just this series of, beautiful accidents that made, this brand new bookstore that she designed and built on paper really inclusive of all of our shared experience working at independent bookstores. It was incredible.
Do you see yourself writing more future books? I mean,
I've been trying to write other picture books. I've written a couple of nonfiction picture books,
right.
but writing, this book feels like nonfiction to me because it so comes
Like
from
a
my
memoir.
direct. It feels like memoir. It really does. I never thought about that, but that's very true. It feels like very much a list of tasks that we do to shut the bookstore down every night. And I would love to write more picture books. I would love to write fiction picture books. I have lots of ideas for them, but they're incomplete. And I'm drawn to stories. I'm drawn to nonfiction stories. Like I always say, I would rather look it up than make it up. I'd rather interview someone and hear about their experience and tell a story in a new way, than to just, to the idea of creating an entire world in my head, like a fantasy author or science fiction author. That's completely overwhelming to me. I would rather drop into a point in history and retell that story, but bring new perspectives to it so that we can excite young readers about history, science, and the natural world in new ways that maybe haven't been shared with them before. There's new voices that need to be brought into these conversations about age-old topics. And I think that's a really important part of my nonfiction writing. So maybe I'll write another picture book someday or a fiction picture book, but probably more nonfiction picture books in the near future. Stephanie?
That segues into Alan Wolf's question. He's
Great.
joining us from not too far away online. And he's just asking if you can talk about what comes next, if you have any specific upcoming projects.
Yes. Upcoming projects. Right now, I am working on my next narrative nonfiction book for middle schoolers. It is called Virus Hunters. And I conceived of this idea during March 2020, which will come as a surprise to absolutely no one on the planet. And when we started locking the world down and no one could go anywhere and nobody understood what was happening, or if we were safe in the grocery store, I did what I always do, which is start researching something to make sense out of it. And when I started researching all of these pandemics throughout history, I was weirdly comforted because they're always the same. And it almost became like a playbook. I could read about plague. I could read about the 1918 influenza. I could read about Ebola. I could read about cholera and see the same mistakes of people in power, the same fearlessness of virus hunters and people that are trying to save people throughout history. And so these themes don't change throughout pandemics. All that changes is the people. It only changes the people that are living that story at their time. And so I wanted to drop readers, the book sort of drops readers into these notorious hot zones throughout history and introduces them to the people that are trying to help. Because I think what we all need right now in thinking about, living through the pandemic that we're living through and getting on the other side of it, I wanted to be able to give some context for that. And so hopefully this book will do that. So that is my next project, and it is supposed to come out in 2024. So I'm very much deep into the research on that book right now.
We have time for one more question from the in-store audience. I don't see any more online. Or we can go to book signing.
Any more questions, anybody?
I like how the lettering, it's Curious George.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
There's so many loving nods to Curious George, to all of these iconic books, and to Goodnight Moon, which I probably should say, when I started sharing this book with people, my agent and then my editor and even, friends that I asked to read it, the first thing they said was, oh my gosh, this is Goodnight Moon. And it had never occurred to me, because to me, I was saying goodnight to everything in the bookstore. And the first time I heard that comment, I thought, wow, absolutely. I didn't realize it at the time, but this is what great books do. This is what great stories from our childhood do. They just become a part of us, and we're not aware, of them consciously, I don't think anymore, which I think to me was a really wonderful part of this experience, was realizing that I was, quite accidentally paying homage to this book that was very important to me, and it's been hugely important to generations of people. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it.